They looked at her and saw nothing but a bad investment. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with a frame that seemed too fragile for the brutal demands of the cotton or tobacco fields. She was missing front teeth. Her skin was scarred. And worst of all, she was damaged goods, in the most literal, profitable sense of the word. She suffered from strange, sudden sleeping spells that would drop her to the ground in the middle of a sentence or a task, leaving her unconscious and vulnerable. To the overseers and the slave masters of Maryland's eastern shore, she was a defect, a liability, a piece of property that wasn't worth the food she ate. They looked at her, and they laughed. They laughed because they thought she was weak. They laughed because they thought she was broken. But they didn't know who they were looking at. They didn't know that the sleeping spells were not a sign of madness, but a gateway to a terrifying, divine intuition that would guide her through minefields and swamps where grown men perished. They didn't know that beneath that scarred skin beat the heart of the greatest guerrilla warfare tactician in American history. They didn't know that this small, illiterate, disabled woman would cost the Southern aristocracy millions of dollars, humiliate their armies, and liberate more souls than any other private citizen in the nation's history. They saw a slave named Minty. History would know her as the General, as Moses, as Harriet Tubman. This is not the bedtime story you were taught in elementary school. This is not a story about a polite woman asking for freedom. This is the story of a war. A war fought in the shadows, in the swamps, and on the rivers, led by a woman who carried a pistol on her hip and the voice of God in her head. A woman who famously said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves." But before we step into the darkness with her, I have a question for you. When you hear the name Harriet Tubman, what is the first word that comes to your mind? Is it rescuer, victim, hero? I want you to go to the comments right now and type one word: general. Let's reframe the history right here, right now. Let's give her the rank she earned, but was never officially granted. To understand the general, you must first understand the hell that forged her. Born Araminta Ross around 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland, she entered a world designed to crush the human spirit before it could even form. The eastern shore of Maryland was a landscape of flat, marshy gloom, where the humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket, and the line between land and water was always shifting. It was a place of isolation. For the enslaved population, the world ended at the tree line. Beyond that was the unknown, the patrol, the dog, and the whip. From the moment she could walk, Minty was put to work. She wasn't just a field hand. She was rented out to other masters, treated like a tool to be used until it broke. At the age of 6, she was taken from her mother and forced to check muskrat traps in the freezing marshes. Imagine a 6-year-old girl wading through icy water in the dead of winter, her legs numb, her hands bleeding, checking steel traps for vermin. If she came back empty-handed, she was beaten. If she caught a muskrat but ruined the pelt, she was beaten. It was a lesson in pain that started early. She learned that the world was cold, indifferent, and violent. She learned that her body did not belong to her. It belonged to men who saw her only as a line item in a ledger. But the defining moment of her life, the moment that killed Araminta Ross and gave birth to the legend, happened when she was an adolescent. It was an incident of casual, senseless violence that should have ended her life, but instead transformed it. She had been sent to a dry goods store on an errand. While she was there, an overseer cornered a runaway slave who had left the fields without permission. The overseer was furious. He demanded that Minty help him tie the runaway down so he could be whipped. In that moment, a young girl who had known nothing but obedience made a choice. She refused. She stood in the doorway, blocking the overseer's path, allowing the runaway to bolt into the street. The overseer, blinded by rage, grabbed a 2-pound metal weight from the counter, a heavy iron weight used for measuring scales, and hurled it with all his might at the fleeing man. He missed. The weight struck Minty directly in the forehead. The sound of iron hitting bone was sickening. The blow crushed her skull, driving fragments of bone into her brain. She collapsed onto the wooden floor, bleeding, unconscious, to all appearances, dead. The overseer didn't call a doctor. He didn't show remorse. She was essentially kicked back to her owner's plantation and thrown onto the seat of a loom, where she lay for days, drifting in and out of a coma, with no medical attention, no pain relief, nothing but the cool cloth her mother placed on her brow. By all medical logic of the 1830s, she should have died. The trauma was catastrophic, but she didn't die. She woke up, but she didn't wake up the same. The injury had fundamentally rewired her brain. For the rest of her life, she would suffer from temporal lobe epilepsy. Without warning, she would fall into a deep, death-like sleep. It could happen while she was working, while she was talking, while she was walking. To the outside world, she looked like she was narcoleptic, weak, unfit. Her master tried to sell her, but no one wanted a defective slave. He couldn't even give her away. But inside her head, something else was happening. During these spells, and in her dreams, Harriet began to see things. Vivid, technicolor visions. She heard music. She heard voices. She saw landscapes she had never visited. She saw rivers flowing north. She believed, with an unshakable, ironclad certainty, that she was speaking directly to God. To a modern neurologist, these were hallucinations caused by brain damage. To Harriet Tubman, they were tactical intel from the Creator. This distinction matters, because it gave her something that no other slave, and indeed very few people in history, have ever possessed: the total absence of doubt. When she woke up from a vision and said, "God told me to go left," she went left. She didn't second guess. She didn't weigh the odds. She moved with the confidence of a woman who has a map that no one else can see. The injury that was meant to break her had instead armored her. It had severed her fear. The slave owners looked at the scar on her forehead and saw a broken vessel. Harriet looked in the mirror and saw the mark of the chosen. But visions alone do not make a warrior. You need skills. And as she recovered, earning her keep in the only way she could, by working in the forests with her father, Ben Ross, she began her basic training. Ben was a timber inspector, a man who knew the woods better than any white man in the county. He taught Harriet how to read the language of the wilderness. He taught her that moss grows on the north side of the tree, giving her a compass that couldn't be confiscated. He taught her to walk silently on dry leaves. He taught her which berries would kill her and which roots would sustain her. He taught her how to mimic the call of an owl to signal safety or danger. She became physically powerful. Despite her small stature, she was hauling logs that grown men struggled to lift. She was driving oxen. She was surviving in the marshes. She was becoming a creature of the night and the woods. While the white society was busy sipping tea and discussing the economics of cotton, Harriet was in the mud, learning how to disappear. She was no longer just a field hand. She was a survivor. She was a scout. By 1849, the rumors began to swirl. The plantation owner had died, and the estate was in debt. The whispers in the slave quarters were terrifying. The family was going to be sold. Sold south. To a slave in Maryland, being sold to Georgia or Mississippi was a death sentence. It meant working in the rice paddies or the sugar fields, where the life expectancy was measured in single-digit years. It meant never seeing your family again. Harriet looked at her brothers. She looked at her parents. And she looked at the North Star. The visions came harder now. She saw a line. On one side of the line was the sunlit golden land of freedom. On the other side was the darkness of bondage. She saw herself crossing that line. But she also saw the horsemen behind her. She saw the dogs. She saw the guns. She tried to convince her brothers to run with her. They started out, but fear overcame them. The unknown was too terrifying. The penalty for being caught, whipping, mutilation, sail to the deep south, was too high. They turned back. They begged her to come with them. "It's suicide," they said. "You're sick. You'll fall asleep on the road and they'll catch you." Harriet looked at them. She loved them, but she loved freedom more. She turned her back on her brothers. She turned her back on the only life she had ever known. And alone, unarmed, with a hole in her head and a bounty on her back, she walked into the woods. She was leaving Araminta Ross behind. She was stepping into the skin of Harriet Tubman. The journey she was about to undertake was 90 miles of hostile territory. There were slave catchers patrolling every road. There were rewards for her capture posted on every tree. There was the constant threat of starvation and the treachery of the swamp. Most people would have died in the first 3 days. Most people would have been caught, dragged back in chains, and made an example of. But they weren't hunting a person. They were hunting a ghost. And as the sun set on that first night of her escape, Harriet Tubman wasn't just running away. She was declaring war. The United States government, the laws of Maryland, and the entire economic system of the South said she was property. She was about to prove them all wrong. The general was on the move, and she was just getting started. The 90 miles between the slave fields of Maryland and the free soil of Pennsylvania was not a road. It was a killing floor. When we talk about the Underground Railroad today, we often use soft language. We think of stations and conductors, and it sounds organized, almost safe. But for Harriet Tubman in 1849, the Underground Railroad was a chaotic, terrifying, and fragile web of safe houses separated by miles of hostile wilderness. It was a network built on whispers and handshakes, where one wrong knock on a door meant death. Harriet navigated this gauntlet alone. She moved at night, guided by the moss on the trees and the star in the sky. She hid in potato holes and haylofts. She trusted her life to white Quakers and free black abolitionists she had never met, people whose names she didn't know, hoping that the secret code words she had been given were still valid. When she finally crossed the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania, the feeling was not just relief. It was transcendence. She would later describe the moment with a poetry that pierces the soul. "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." For the first time in 27 years, Harriet Tubman belonged to herself. The money she earned scrubbing floors in Philadelphia was hers to keep. The fear of the whip was gone. She was free. But freedom, she quickly realized, was a hollow prize if you had to enjoy it alone. She walked the streets of Philadelphia, a city teeming with free black people, but her heart was back in the marshes of Dorchester County. Her parents were there. Her brothers were there. Her friends were there. They were still waking up to the overseer's horn. They were still liable to be sold south at any moment. "I was a stranger in a strange land," she said. "My father, my mother, my brothers, and sisters were in slavery. I was free, and they should be free." In that moment, Harriet Tubman made a decision that defies every instinct of self-preservation. Most fugitives, once they reached the safety of the North, spent their lives looking over their shoulders, terrified of being dragged back. They changed their names. They moved to Canada. They tried to disappear. Harriet decided to go back. It is hard to overstate the insanity of this choice. She was a fugitive slave with a bounty on her head. She was a woman with a disability that could render her unconscious at any moment, and she was choosing to walk back into the prison she had just broken out of. It was a suicide mission, but to Harriet, it wasn't a choice. It was a command. The voice of God in her head was not telling her to rest. It was telling her to move. In December 1850, she made her first trip back. It was a rescue mission for her niece, Keziah, and Keziah's 2 children, who were about to be sold at auction. Harriet navigated the freezing woods of the eastern shore, orchestrated their escape, and guided them to safety. She did it again in 1851, and again in 1852. Over the next decade, Harriet Tubman transformed from a runaway into a phantom. She became the Moses of her people, but the methods she used were not the methods of a biblical prophet. They were the methods of a spy master. She developed a tradecraft that would rival any modern intelligence agency. She knew that the slave catchers expected runaways to move north, so sometimes she would move south first, throwing off the scent. She operated in the winter, when the nights were long and the people stayed indoors. She preferred to leave on Saturday nights, knowing that the runaway notices couldn't be printed in the newspapers until Monday morning. That gave her a 36-hour head start. She used the songs of the enslaved as an encrypted communication system. A certain spiritual sung at a certain tempo wasn't just a call to prayer. It was a tactical instruction. Wade in the water meant the dogs were coming, and the party needed to get into the river to mask their scent. Go down, Moses meant the conductor was in the area. She could stand in a field, singing loud enough for the workers to hear, and convey complex logistical information without the overseer understanding a word. She became a master of disguise. She would dress as an old woman, hunched over, buying live chickens. Once, she saw her former master walking down the street towards her. She knew that if he saw her eyes, he would recognize her. So, she yanked the string on the chicken's legs. The birds started flapping and squawking, creating a chaotic distraction. She bent down to chase them, hiding her face, and her master walked right past, never knowing he had just brushed shoulders with the woman who was stealing his property. But her most famous tool was not a disguise. It was a pistol. Harriet carried a revolver on her hip. To the modern mind, the image of Grandma Harriet with a gun seems jarring. But this was not a prop. It was a necessity. Harriet understood the psychology of fear. She knew that the journey north was terrifying. The fugitives she led were often exhausted, starving, and hearing the baying of the hounds in the distance. There were moments when a member of the party would break. They would freeze. They would say, "I can't go on. I'm going back." A person turning back was a catastrophic threat. If they were caught, they would be tortured. They would give up the location of the safe houses. They would give up the names of the white abolitionists who helped them. They would give up the route. They would give up Harriet. So, when a man or woman refused to move, Harriet would draw her revolver. She would point it at their head, and she would say the words that have become legend: "You'll be free or die." She wasn't bluffing. She was prepared to kill a fellow slave to protect the operational security of the Underground Railroad. She understood the grim calculus of war. The mission is more important than the individual. No one she threatened ever turned back. They looked into her eyes, saw the steel there, and found the strength to keep walking. This is the Harriet Tubman that history books often sanitize. They want her to be a gentle savior. She was a ruthless commander. She had to be. Her sleeping spells remained her constant companion and her greatest liability. Imagine leading a group of 10 terrified people through a swamp at midnight, only to suddenly collapse into a coma. The group would have to wait, terrified, hiding her body in the brush, watching over her until she woke up. But here is the miracle. She never fell asleep when the danger was immediate. She claimed that God would only let her sleep when they were safe, or to give her a vision of the danger ahead. On one famous journey, she woke up from a spell and abruptly ordered the group to cross a river, deviating from the planned route. The group argued. The river was cold and deep. Harriet marched into the water alone. They followed. Later, they learned that a posse of slave catchers had been waiting in ambush on the road they had abandoned. Was it luck? Was it subconscious processing of environmental cues? Or was it, as she believed, the voice of the Almighty? To the people following her, it didn't matter. She was infallible. Her reputation grew. The slave owners of the Eastern Shore were baffled. Property was vanishing into thin air. They posted rewards. The figure of Moses became an obsession for them. But their racism blinded them. They assumed Moses must be a white abolitionist from the North, or perhaps a free black man with military training. They could not conceive that the mastermind dismantling their economy was a 5-foot-tall black woman who couldn't read or write. The bounty on her head is a subject of historical debate. You will often hear the number $40,000, which would be over $1 million today. While no single poster has been found with that specific amount, the cumulative rewards offered by various states and individual masters for her capture were astronomical. She was the most wanted fugitive in America. And yet, she never lost a passenger. Think about that statistic. 19 trips, 300 souls, and many more through her instructions. Not one person captured. Not one person died on the trail. In the history of covert operations, that success rate is unparalleled. She brought out her brothers. She brought out her parents, an elderly couple who could barely walk. She built a rig, a makeshift wagon, to transport them. She bribed people. She stole horses. She forged passes. She did whatever was necessary. By the late 1850s, Harriet Tubman was no longer just a nuisance to the South. She was a political problem. The success of the Underground Railroad and the embarrassment of the inability to catch her helped push the South toward the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a law that allowed slave catchers to kidnap black people in the North and drag them back south. This law changed the game. Philadelphia was no longer safe. New York was no longer safe. To be truly free, a fugitive had to cross the border into Canada. So Harriet extended her line. She walked her people all the way to St. Catharines, Ontario. She marched them through the snows of upstate New York, across the suspension bridge at Niagara Falls. She watched them step onto British soil, where the laws of American slavery held no power. She had become an international operator, but as the decade closed, the storm clouds of Civil War were gathering. Harriet was in Boston, meeting with the leading abolitionists of the day, men like Frederick Douglass and John Brown. John Brown, the fiery radical who believed that only blood could purge the sin of slavery, was planning his raid on Harper's Ferry. He wanted to start a massive armed slave revolt. When he met Harriet Tubman, he didn't see a conductor. He saw a soldier. He called her General Tubman. He asked for her help. He wanted her to recruit former slaves for his army. He wanted her knowledge of the terrain. Harriet admired Brown. She believed in his mission. She helped him recruit. She might have even been with him at Harper's Ferry if illness hadn't kept her away. When John Brown was hanged in 1859, Harriet didn't mourn him as a failure. She saw him as a martyr who had fired the first shot of the holy war she knew was coming. The Underground Railroad had been her training ground. It had taught her logistics. It had taught her stealth. It had taught her how to lead men and women in life or death situations. It had transformed Araminta Ross into Harriet Tubman. But the time for hiding in the woods was ending. The time for open war was beginning. In 1861, the cannons fired on Fort Sumter. The South seceded. The Union Army mobilized. And Harriet Tubman, the most experienced field operative in the abolitionist movement, knew exactly where she needed to be. She wasn't going to Canada. She was going south. She was about to trade her revolver for a rifle. She was about to trade her secret paths for the deck of a gunboat. The conductor was retiring. The general was reporting for duty. And the Confederacy had no idea what was coming for them. In the spring of 1862, Harriet Tubman arrived at Port Royal, South Carolina. The Union Navy had captured the Sea Islands, establishing a foothold deep in the heart of the Confederacy. It was a strange, chaotic new world. The white plantation owners had fled, leaving behind thousands of enslaved people who were now technically contraband of war, not quite free, but no longer slaves. To the Union officers stationed there, this population was a logistical nightmare. They were refugees. They were hungry. They were confusing. The white officers, many of whom had never interacted with black people outside of a servant role, didn't understand their dialect, their culture, or their needs. Enter Harriet Tubman. She arrived with a letter of introduction from the governor of Massachusetts, but to the soldiers on the dock, she looked like just another refugee. She was small, dressed in rough clothes, her face weathered by years of exposure. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, looked at the most experienced field operative in America and handed her a ladle. They assigned her to the laundry and the kitchen. They asked her to bake gingerbread and brew root beer to sell to the soldiers. During the day, she worked in the contraband hospitals, tending to men dying of dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox. And here, the legend of Harriet's divine protection grew. Smallpox was a terror in the camps. It killed indiscriminately. Nurses and doctors died alongside their patients. But Harriet Tubman walked into the quarantine tents without hesitation. She held the hands of the dying. She wiped the fever sweat from their brows. She breathed the infected air. And she never got sick. Not once. To the soldiers, both black and white, she seemed to be made of iron. But while her hands were busy healing the sick, her mind was busy dissecting the war. Harriet looked at the Union Army and saw a giant, stumbling blind man. The Northern troops were fighting in a terrain they didn't understand. A landscape of tidal creeks, malaria-choked swamps, and dense pine forests. They were getting ambushed. They were stepping on torpedoes, mines in the rivers. They were fighting an enemy that knew every tree and every sandbar. The Union generals were desperate for intelligence. They needed to know where the Confederate batteries were hidden. They needed to know the depth of the rivers. They needed to know how many troops were guarding the cotton stockpiles. Harriet went to General David Hunter, the commander of the Department of the South. She didn't bow. She didn't scrape. She spoke to him with the authority of a woman who had outwitted the entire slave-catching apparatus of the South for a decade. She told him that if he wanted to win, he had to stop looking at the contraband as a burden and start looking at them as assets. You have an army of spies, she essentially told him. You just aren't listening to them. The enslaved people who were still working on the plantations behind Confederate lines were not passive observers. They were the eyes and ears of the South. They heard the dinner table conversations of the Confederate officers. They saw where the ammunition was buried. They knew who was demoralized and who was digging in. Harriet proposed a plan that was radical for 1862. She would build a spy ring. General Hunter, to his credit, agreed. He gave her the authority to draw rations and money to pay scouts. And just like that, the former conductor became a spy master. She recruited a team of black men, river pilots, woodsmen, field hands, men who knew the waterways like the backs of their hands. She trained them in her methods. She taught them how to move silently, how to memorize details without writing them down, how to blend in. Harriet herself began to go behind enemy lines. This is the part of her life that is most often left out of the school books. We picture her leading people north. We rarely picture her slipping past Confederate sentries in South Carolina, dressed as an old, feeble woman, carrying a basket of eggs or a bag of laundry. She weaponized her invisibility. To the Confederate soldiers, a black woman walking down a dirt road was part of the scenery. She was beneath notice. They would talk freely in front of her, discussing troop movements and supply shortages, never suspecting that the auntie shuffling past was memorizing every word. She mapped the rivers. She identified the location of the torpedoes, kegs of gunpowder rigged to blow up Union gunboats. She located the cotton stores that were funding the Confederate war effort. She would return to the Union lines, debrief her scouts, and then present her findings to the generals. The intelligence she provided was startlingly accurate. It was actionable. The Union Army began to win skirmishes based on her reports. They began to avoid ambushes. They began to target the weak points in the Confederate line. But Harriet wasn't just gathering info. She was analyzing the economics of the war. She understood that the Confederacy's strength was not just in its army, but in its agriculture. The plantations were the supply depots. The enslaved people were the labor force that kept the rebel army fed and clothed. She argued that to win the war, the Union didn't just need to kill soldiers. It needed to destroy the economic engine of the South. It needed to burn the crops and liberate the labor force. It was a strategy of total war, directed at the institution of slavery itself. She found a kindred spirit in Colonel James Montgomery. Montgomery was a white abolitionist from Kansas, a man who had fought alongside John Brown. He was a Jayhawker, a guerrilla fighter who believed in fire and sword. He commanded the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, a regiment of black soldiers, freed slaves who were eager to take the fight to their former masters. Montgomery respected Harriet. He didn't treat her like a subordinate. He treated her like a partner. He saw her general rank not as a nickname, but as a reality. When they looked at a map together, it was a meeting of minds. By the summer of 1863, the pieces were in place. Harriet had the intelligence. She knew the Combahee River was the soft underbelly of the local Confederate defenses. She knew which plantations were rich with supplies. She knew where the mines were planted in the water. And she knew that thousands of enslaved people along that river were waiting for a signal to run. She went to the commanders and proposed a raid, not a skirmish, not a probe. A massive, amphibious assault designed to gut the local economy and spark a mass exodus of slaves. It was an audacious plan. It required navigating 3 gunboats, the John Adams, the Harriet A. Weed, and the Sentinel, up a winding mined river, landing troops, burning estates, and extracting hundreds of civilians, all while under fire. The Union brass approved it, but they did something unprecedented. They gave the operational lead to Harriet. Let that sink in. In 1863, women could not vote. They could not own property in many states. Black people were legally considered inferior. And yet, the United States Army entrusted the planning and guidance of a major military operation to a black woman. It was a tacit admission that she was the most capable person in the room. On the night of June 1st, 1863, the gunboats gathered at the mouth of the Combahee River. The 2nd South Carolina Volunteers checked their rifles. These were men who had been slaves just months before. Now, they were wearing the blue uniform of the United States. And standing on the deck of the lead ship, the John Adams, was Harriet Tubman. She wasn't wearing a general's stars. She was wearing a simple dress and a bandana. But as the engines rumbled to life and the ships began to cut through the dark water, every eye was on her. She was the navigator. She was the commander. She had spent years hiding in the woods, running from dogs, speaking in whispers. Tonight, she was done hiding. Tonight, she was coming for them with steam engines and howitzers. The spy had finished her work. The general was about to take the field. As the ships moved upriver, bypassing the mines that Harriet's scouts had identified, the silence of the South Carolina night was about to be shattered by the whistle of liberation. The Combahee River Raid was not just a military maneuver. It was the climax of Harriet Tubman's life's work. It was the moment she stopped saving people one by one and started saving them by the hundreds. The next block will take us into the chaos and glory of that raid. We will see Harriet standing on the deck, singing amidst the smoke, as an empire burned and a people rose up. The raid that made her the only woman in American history to lead an armed assault during the Civil War is about to begin. The Combahee River winds like a black snake through the low country of South Carolina. In 1863, its banks were lined with some of the wealthiest plantations in the South, vast empires of rice and cotton built on the backs of thousands of enslaved people. The river was the artery of the region's economy, but on the night of June 2nd, it became a throat, and Harriet Tubman was the knife. The 3 Union gunboats moved in a single file, their steam engines thrumming a low, rhythmic beat against the water. On the deck of the John Adams, the lead vessel, Colonel James Montgomery stood with his eyes scanning the tree line, but he wasn't the one steering the ship's course. Beside him, peering into the murky darkness, was Harriet. This was the moment where her intelligence work faced the ultimate test. The Confederate forces had mined the river with torpedoes, large kegs of gunpowder submerged just below the surface, rigged to blow the hull out of any Yankee ship foolish enough to attempt a crossing. A single mistake would send hundreds of men to the bottom. But Harriet knew where they were. Her scouts had mapped them out, memorized the bends and the shallows where death waited. As the ship approached the danger zones, she would lift her hand, pointing the pilot to the safe channel. The gunboat weaved back and forth, a massive steel dancer led by a woman who couldn't read a nautical chart, but could read the river like a scripture. At approximately 2:30 a.m., the silence of the low country was shattered. The whistle of the John Adams screamed into the night, the signal to attack. The gunboats split up, targeting different landings along the river. As they hit the shore, the ramparts dropped, and the soldiers of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers poured out. These were not white soldiers from Ohio or New York fighting for an abstract concept of union. These were black men, many of them former slaves from this very region. They were returning to the land of their bondage, not as property, but as avenging angels. The raids were executed with a speed and ferocity that stunned the Confederate defenders. The soldiers swept through the plantations of the Hayward, Middleton, and Lowndes families, names that had struck terror into the hearts of the enslaved for generations. The overseers and masters, waking up to the sound of gunfire and the sight of black troops in blue uniforms, fled in panic. They didn't even try to fight. They ran into the woods, leaving their mansions and their property behind. Colonel Montgomery's orders were clear. Destroy everything that could aid the Confederate war effort. The soldiers set fire to the massive barns filled with cotton. They torched the rice mills. They burned the grand plantation houses that stood as monuments to the wealth extracted from stolen labor. The night sky turned a bruised purple and then a furious orange as millions of dollars of Confederate assets were incinerated. But the destruction was just the prelude. The true objective was the people. As the buildings burned, the whistle of the steamship blew again. To the thousands of enslaved people hiding in the slave quarters, listening to the chaos, that whistle was the sound of the Jubilee. It was the trumpet of Gabriel. And then the stampede began. Harriet Tubman stood on the deck of the ship and watched a scene that she would later describe as the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. From every direction, people came running. They came through the rice paddies, splashing through the mud. They came through the woods, tearing their clothes on the briars. They came carrying everything they owned on their backs. It was a chaotic, desperate, glorious flood of humanity. There were women carrying babies in one arm and squawking chickens in the other. There were old men hobbling on canes. There were children dragging bags of rice that were heavier than they were. One woman, Harriet recalled, ran down to the shore with a pot of rice still steaming from the fire, balancing it on her head, unwilling to leave behind her family's breakfast even in the moment of liberation. Another carried a pig under her arm, the animal squealing in terror, adding to the cacophony. They reached the riverbank by the hundreds. The Union rowboats, sent to ferry them to the gunboats, were instantly swarmed. The desperation was palpable. These people knew that this was a one-time offer. If they missed the boat, the overseers would return with dogs and whips. If they stayed, they would face the wrath of masters humiliated by the raid. They clawed at the gunwales of the small boats, threatening to capsize them in their panic. Colonel Montgomery, looking down at the chaotic mass of humanity, turned to Harriet. He realized he had lost control. "Moses," he said, "you'll have to give them a song." Harriet stepped to the railing. She raised her voice, a voice that had sung in the hush of the Maryland woods, a voice that carried the weight of a general. She sang an improvised anthem of freedom. Come along, don't be alarmed. Uncle Sam is rich enough to give you all a farm." The sound of her voice cut through the panic. The crowd on the shore looked up and saw her, a small black woman standing high above them on the warship, her arms outstretched. She was the conductor, and this was the biggest train she had ever led. Her presence calmed them. They realized they weren't being left behind. The loading became orderly. One by one, family by family, they were pulled from the mud of slavery onto the deck of freedom. More than 750 people were liberated that night, as the gunboats turned back downriver, heavily laden with their human cargo. The sun began to rise. The soldiers and the newly freed people watched the shoreline recede. They saw the pillars of smoke rising from the ruins of the plantations. They saw the bridges burning, cutting off the Confederate pursuit. They left behind a landscape that had been utterly transformed. The raid was a catastrophe for the Confederacy. In one night, Harriet Tubman and Colonel Montgomery had destroyed the agricultural output of an entire district. They had humiliated the local Confederate command, who had been unable to stop a force led by a black woman, and they had stripped the enemy of their labor force. But for the Union, it was a double victory. When the ships docked at Beaufort, Harriet went among the liberated men. She didn't let them rest. She was a recruiter now. She told them that they had tasted freedom, but now they had to fight to keep it. She told them that the only way to ensure they would never be slaves again was to put on the blue uniform and pick up a rifle. "You have been liberated," she essentially told them. "Now become liberators." Inspired by her and by the sight of the black soldiers who had saved them, hundreds of the newly freed men joined the Union Army that very week. They formed the core of new regiments that would go on to fight at Fort Wagner and Olustee. Harriet hadn't just saved refugees. She had recruited a battalion. The Combahee River Raid remains the only military campaign in American history planned and led by a woman. It was a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. It combined intelligence gathering, economic sabotage, and psychological operations into a single, devastating blow. And yet, when the reports were filed, Harriet's name was often omitted or relegated to the footnotes. The newspapers praised Colonel Montgomery. They praised the white officers. But the soldiers knew. The liberated people knew. They knew who had guided the ships. They knew who had gathered the intel. They knew who had sung them to safety. For Harriet, the raid was the validation of everything she had suffered. The blow to her head, the years of fear on the Underground Railroad, the poverty and the pain. It had all been preparation for this night. God had saved her so she could save them. But the war was not over. The euphoria of the raid would soon be tempered by the grinding reality of the conflict. Harriet would continue to serve, moving to the bloody trenches around Fort Wagner. where she would witness the terrible cost of freedom paid by the 54th Massachusetts. She would scrub the blood of heroes from the floor of field hospitals and cook the last meals for men destined to die. She had proven herself as a general. Now, she would have to endure as a witness to the slaughter. The Civil War was entering its darkest, bloodiest phase. The South, wounded and desperate, was fighting with a savage intensity. And Harriet Tubman, the woman with a price on her head, was about to find out that the country she was fighting for had a very short memory when it came to debts owed to black women. The ships have docked, the smoke has cleared, but the betrayal is just around the corner. The next block will take us into the aftermath of the war, where Harriet faces a new enemy, the United States government itself. The smoke from the Combahee River Raid eventually drifted away, but the war did not stop. If anything, it grew hungrier. The summer of 1863 turned into a season of slaughter that tested the resolve of the entire nation. And Harriet Tubman, fresh from her triumph as a commander, walked straight from the deck of the gunboat into the bloodiest chapter of the conflict. She traveled to Fort Wagner. History remembers the 54th Massachusetts, the Glory Regiment, and their suicidal, heroic charge up the beach. We remember Colonel Robert Gould Shaw falling on the parapet, but we often forget who was waiting to pick up the pieces. Harriet Tubman was there. She was serving as a nurse and a scout in the Union camps on Morris Island. On the morning of the assault, she reportedly served Colonel Shaw his last meal. She looked into the eyes of those young black men who were about to prove their humanity with their lives, and she recognized the spirit she had seen on the Underground Railroad. When the broken remnants of the regiment came stumbling back from the fort, Harriet was waiting. She later described the scene with a haunting, visceral clarity. "It was like the dew on the grass," she said of the dead. The bodies were piled so high, the suffering was so immense, that it would have broken a lesser spirit. But Harriet rolled up her sleeves. She didn't have antibiotics. She didn't have morphine. She had root and herb remedies she brewed herself. She had cool water, and she had a presence that quieted the screams of the dying. She worked in the contraband hospitals, places that were often little more than tents pitched in the mud, filled with men dying of dysentery and smallpox. The white nurses and doctors were terrified of the contagious diseases. Harriet was not. She moved among the sick with a casual disregard for her own safety, believing fully that God had not brought her this far to kill her with a fever. She bathed the soldiers, fed them, and held them as they took their last breaths. She was the angel of mercy in a place that looked like hell, but she was also starving. This is the dirty secret of Harriet's war service. The Union Army, while happy to use her genius, often forgot to feed her. She was not officially on the payroll in a way that guaranteed regular rations. While she was saving lives and guiding generals, she was forced to bake pies and brew root beer in the evenings to sell to the soldiers, just to buy enough cornmeal to survive. The woman who had cost the Confederacy millions of dollars was living hand to mouth in the service of the United States. In 1865, the war finally ended. The Confederacy collapsed. The chains were broken. It was the moment of jubilee she had prophesied for decades. But for Harriet, the end of the war brought a new and personal kind of violence. In October 1865, she was traveling by train back north, heading to her home in Auburn, New York. She was carrying an official government pass, signed by officers, stating that she was a nurse and a veteran of the war effort, entitled to military transport. She sat in a car, exhausted, her body aching from 4 years of sleeping on the ground. The conductor came through. He looked at her pass. He looked at her skin, and he sneered. "We don't carry niggers in this car," he said. He ordered her to the smoking car, the baggage car, where black people were forced to ride. Harriet refused. She explained her service. She explained that she was working for the government. She explained that she had rights. The conductor didn't care about her rights. He grabbed her. He tried to drag her out of the seat. But Harriet Tubman was not a woman who could be easily moved. She braced herself, hooking her arm around the seat. She fought back. The conductor called for help. 3 white men, strong, young men, came to his aid. Together, they pried her fingers loose. They crushed her arm. They broke her ribs. They dragged her down the aisle while she shouted her protest. And the most heartbreaking part? The car was full of white Union soldiers, men wearing the same blue uniform she had served, and not one of them stood up. They watched as a 60-year-old war hero was brutalized and thrown into the baggage car like a sack of grain. She arrived in Auburn battered, bruised, and broken. It was a stark, brutal lesson. The war against slavery was over, but the war against racism had just begun. The uniform didn't protect her. Her service didn't protect her. To the country she had helped save, she was still just a black woman in a white man's world. And then began the battle for her pension. If there is any justice in the world, Harriet Tubman should have been retired with a general's pension. She should have been given a land grant. She should have been feted in Washington. Instead, she spent the next 30 years begging the government for the scraps from the table. She applied for back pay. She estimated that the government owed her $1,800 for her service as a scout and a spy, a conservative estimate given the value of her work. The government's response was a bureaucratic wall of silence. They had no category for her. Was she a soldier? No, women couldn't be soldiers. Was she a nurse? Maybe, but she wasn't in the official nursing corps. Was she a spy? Spies don't get pensions. They engaged in a shameful game of semantics. They demanded proof. Harriet had to go to the generals she had served, men like General Hunter and General Saxton, and ask them to write letters testifying that she had actually done what she said she did. These men wrote glowing recommendations. "She rendered more service than any man in my command," one officer wrote. But the clerks in Washington didn't care. They rejected her claims on technicalities. They lost her paperwork. They delayed. They waited for her to die. It wasn't just about the money, though she desperately needed it. She was supporting her elderly parents and countless other dependents in her home in Auburn. It was about respect. It was about recognition. The refusal to pay her was a denial of her history. It was the government saying, "Your sacrifice does not count." For decades, Harriet Tubman, the general, lived in poverty. She grew vegetables in her garden and walked door to door selling them to her neighbors. She raised chickens. She took in boarders. She accepted charity from her former abolitionist friends. The woman who had walked through minefields was now worrying about the price of flour. Yet she never became bitter. She never stopped working. When neighbors were sick, she went to them with her herbal medicines. When hungry people knocked on her door, she fed them, even if it meant she didn't eat that night. Her home became a sanctuary for the cast-offs of society, the orphans, the disabled, the elderly freedmen who had nowhere else to go. She also found a new war to fight, the suffrage movement. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, women across America were organizing to demand the right to vote. Harriet threw herself into the cause. She toured the Northeast, speaking at conventions. She shared the stage with women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But Harriet was different from the polished, educated white women of the movement. When she stood up to speak, she didn't talk about abstract political theories. She talked about blood. She talked about carrying a rifle. She talked about leading men into battle. "I was a conductor on the Underground Railroad for 8 years, she would tell the crowds, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." She was a living rebuke to the argument that women were the weaker sex. When anti-suffragists argued that women were too fragile for politics, Harriet Tubman just had to stand there. Her very existence destroyed their argument. She was tougher than any man in the room, but even within the suffrage movement, she faced the complexity of race. White suffragettes were often willing to throw black women under the bus to gain the support of white Southern women. Harriet navigated this with her usual blunt wisdom. She stood her ground. She reminded them that she had fought for a freedom that was inclusive, not exclusive. In 1890, after nearly 30 years of fighting, the U.S. government finally granted her a pension. But it was the ultimate insult. They didn't grant it for her service as a scout or a spy. They granted it because her husband, John Davis, a veteran she had married after the war, had died. She was given a widow's pension of $8 a month. $8 for the woman who led the Combahee River Raid, for the woman who nursed the 54th Massachusetts, for the woman who was Moses. Later, due to immense political pressure, they increased it to $20. It was a pittance. It was less than the salary of the lowest private in the army. But Harriet took it. She used it to buy bricks for her final dream, a hospital for the aged and indigent black people of her community. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, Harriet began to slow down. The body that had endured the lash, the rock, the cold, and the war was finally wearing out. The sleeping spells became more frequent. She was frail, but her mind was sharp. She began to tell her story to a biographer, Sarah Bradford, to raise money. She wanted to make sure that even if the government erased her from the ledgers, she would be written into the history books. She understood that memory was a battlefield, and she wasn't going to let them forget. She bought a plot of land next to her home. She worked with the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and in 1908, 5 years before her death, she opened the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged. At the opening ceremony, she didn't talk about her glory days. She talked about service. She talked about the duty of the strong to look after the weak. She had spent her life running, fighting, and hiding. Now, she was building a place where people could rest. The general was finally building her fortress. But it wasn't made of earthworks and cannons. It was made of charity and brick. But as she sat on the porch of that home, wrapped in a shawl, looking out at the apple trees, she knew that her fight wasn't over. She knew that the country she had given everything to was still broken. Jim Crow was the law of the land. Lynchings were an epidemic. The vote was still denied to women. She had led her people to the promised land, but they were still wandering in the desert. The final block of our story will take us to her deathbed, and then into the century-long struggle to give her the honor she earned. We will look at how she became an icon, and why, even today, her face is still terrifying to some people in power. The general is about to take her final rest, but her spirit is about to become immortal. So, we have the story, the escape, the rescues, the raid, the spy ring. But to truly understand Harriet Tubman, to understand how a 5-foot-tall, illiterate, disabled woman managed to outwit the entire military and police apparatus of the South for a decade, we have to look beyond the sequence of events. We have to look at the weaponry she used. Because Harriet Tubman did not survive on luck. She survived because she mastered a form of asymmetrical warfare that her enemies couldn't even comprehend. Her first and most terrifying weapon was her mind. Or, more specifically, the injury to her mind. To the medical doctors of the 19th century, and perhaps even today, the dent in her skull was a disability. It was a tragedy. But Harriet Tubman refused to accept that narrative. She took the brain damage inflicted by a slave overseer and alchemized it into a strategic advantage. The sleeping spells and the vivid hallucinatory visions were not, to her, symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy. They were intelligence reports from the highest authority. Whether you are a person of faith or a person of science, you have to acknowledge the tactical result of her visions. In the middle of a hostile swamp, surrounded by slave catchers with bloodhounds, Harriet would fall asleep. When she woke up, she would have absolute, unshakable certainty about which path to take. She would say, "God told me to go left," and she would go left. This lack of doubt is a superpower in combat. Doubt kills. Hesitation kills. Harriet removed the friction of decision-making. She moved with a conviction that terrified her enemies and galvanized her followers. When she told a group of frightened runaways to wade into an icy river because the Lord said so, they did it. Not because they saw the logic, but because they saw her. They saw a woman who was vibrating with a frequency of truth that was impossible to ignore. She turned her trauma into a divine GPS. Her second weapon was her invisibility. We often talk about the invisibility of black women in history as a negative thing, a result of erasure. But Harriet Tubman used it as a cloak of invincibility. The racism of the South was her camouflage. The white slave owners, the Confederate officers, the bounty hunters, they were all looking for a threat that matched their worldview. They were looking for a white abolitionist, or a powerful black man, or a gang of armed insurrectionists. They were psychologically incapable of seeing a threat in a small, older black woman carrying a basket of chickens. Harriet understood this bias perfectly. She played the role of the feeble auntie. She hunched her back. She shuffled her feet. She made herself look harmless. She walked right past wanted posters offering a fortune for her capture, and the men reading those posters didn't even glance at her. She weaponized their bigotry against them. While they were looking for a monster, the general was walking through their front gate, counting their soldiers and mapping their defenses. It was the ultimate spycraft, hiding in plain sight, shielded by the enemy's own arrogance. Her third weapon was her ruthlessness. We like to picture Harriet Tubman as a saintly figure, a Moses who gently led her people to freedom. But a conductor on the Underground Railroad could not afford to be gentle. She had to be a disciplinarian. The revolver she carried was not just for protection against slave catchers, it was for crowd control. There is a famous story, confirmed by historical accounts, of a man in one of her escape parties whose nerve broke. The journey was too hard, the cold was too deep, and the fear was too much. He sat down in the mud and said he was going back. He was going to surrender. Harriet knew the math. If he went back, he would be tortured. He would give up the route. He would give up the location of the safe houses. He would give up the names of the babies in the group. His weakness was a death sentence for everyone. Harriet didn't plead with him. She didn't offer him comfort. She pulled out her revolver, leveled it at his head, and said, "Move or die." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. She was prepared to execute a man to save the mission. This is the hard, cold logic of a military commander. It is the logic of a general who knows that the survival of the unit outweighs the life of the individual. The man stood up. He kept walking. He reached freedom. Later, he would likely thank her. But in that moment, he realized he was dealing with a woman who had killed the fear in herself so thoroughly that she wouldn't tolerate it in anyone else. Finally, her weapon was her endurance. By the early 1900s, Harriet was an old woman. The body that had been whipped, beaten with irons, crushed by a weight, frozen in swamps, and starved in the army, was finally failing. Her back hurt constantly. The sleeping spells were more frequent. She lived in poverty, often struggling to keep the lights on in the home for the aged she had founded. But she refused to fade away quietly. She became a storyteller. She realized that since the government wouldn't validate her, she had to validate herself. She worked with Sarah Bradford to publish her biography, not out of vanity, but out of necessity, to raise money to pay the bills and to ensure the history wasn't lost. She sat on her porch in Auburn, New York, wrapped in a shawl, and held court. She became a sage. The suffragettes came to her not just for endorsement, but for strength. When Susan B. Anthony introduced her at a convention, she didn't call her Harriet. She called her this most wonderful of women. Harriet's message to the young activists was simple: keep going. If you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If there's shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop. Keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going. It was the mantra of her life. Momentum was life. Stagnation was death. In 1913, the end finally came. Harriet was in her early 90s. The exact age is unknown because she was born property, and property doesn't get a birth certificate. She developed pneumonia. She lay in her bed in the rest home she had built, surrounded by the community she had nurtured. Even in death, she was a commander. She organized her own funeral rites. She gathered her friends around her bed and led them in song. She didn't choose a dirge. She chose spirituals. She chose the songs of the Underground Railroad. Her final words to the people in the room were a scripture, but they were also a tactical update. I go to prepare a place for you. She wasn't just dying. She was scouting ahead. She was going to the ultimate north, crossing the final river, to make sure the safe house was ready for the rest of them. Harriet Tubman died on March 10th, 1913. Her funeral was a major event in Auburn. She was buried with military honors, a rare tribute for a civilian, and unheard of for a black woman at the time. Members of the Grand Army of the Republic, the veterans of the Union Army, stood at attention. They fired a volley over her grave. They played taps. The flag was draped over her coffin. For a brief moment, the town of Auburn acknowledged what the federal government had tried to deny for 50 years, that a soldier had fallen. But as the earth covered her coffin in Fort Hill Cemetery, a new battle was beginning, the battle for her legacy. In 1913, America was at the nadir of race relations. The Civil War was 50 years gone, and the lost cause narrative was taking over. Statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were going up all over the South. The movie The Birth of a Nation, which glorified the KKK and demonized black people, was just 2 years away from release. Woodrow Wilson was segregating the federal government. In this climate, the story of a black woman who had violently resisted slavery, who had humiliated white men, who had led armed raids, was dangerous. It was subversive. So, the erasure began. The history books didn't delete her entirely. She was too famous for that. Instead, they domesticated her. They stripped her of her pistol. They stripped her of her generalship. They stripped her of her intelligence work. They turned her into a gentle, two-dimensional caricature. She became the Moses of the Sunday school lesson, a kindly figure who helped people run away. They hid the warrior inside the grandmother. For decades, this was the Harriet Tubman that America knew, a safe, non-threatening figure, a symbol of passive resistance rather than active rebellion. But you cannot hide fire in a paper bag forever. The truth burns through. As the 20th century progressed and the civil rights movement exploded in the 1950s and 60s, a new generation of black activists began to look for their ancestors. They weren't looking for victims. They were looking for fighters. And they found Harriet. They went back to the primary sources. They read the letters from the generals. They read the interviews. And they rediscovered the general. They saw the gun. They saw the strategy. They saw the Black Power icon who had existed a century before the term was coined. This rediscovery set the stage for the modern cultural battle over her image. It is why there is such a fierce debate today about putting her face on the $20 bill. To put Harriet Tubman on American currency is not just a gesture of inclusion. It is a radical act. It replaces Andrew Jackson, a slave owner, and the architect of the Trail of Tears, with the woman who stole his property and destroyed his economic system. It is a symbolic conquering of the old America by the new. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before she became an icon on a banknote, she had to survive the long winter of forgetfulness. As the mourners left the cemetery in 1913, they left behind a simple stone. The world moved on. World War I erupted, then the Depression, then World War II. The name Harriet Tubman faded into the background noise of history. But the seeds she had planted, the schools, the home for the aged, the voting rights movement, continued to grow. She had built a foundation that could withstand the silence. The next block will take us into that silence, and then into the resurrection. We will look at how her story was kept alive in the Black community when white America turned its back. We will see how her legacy fueled the Freedom Riders and the Marchers of Selma. And we will see how the general finally got her due, not from the government, but from the people. The body was buried, but the spirit was just reloading. The general had left the battlefield, but her army was still marching. When the first shovel of dirt hit Harriet Tubman's coffin in 1913, a second war began. This was not a war of bullets and bayonets, but a war of ink and narrative. It was a battle over who Harriet Tubman was, what she represented, and most importantly, how she would be remembered by the nation she had transformed. For the first half of the 20th century, white America engaged in a project of historical domestication. They couldn't erase her. She was too famous, her deeds too largely documented. So they did something more insidious. They defanged her. Textbooks in the North began to mention her, but they stripped away the general. They stripped away the spy. They stripped away the revolver. They replaced the fierce, armed insurgent who burned down plantations with a kindly, harmless caricature. She became Aunt Harriet, a gentle, pious old woman who helped a few people run away in the dark. They emphasized her faith, but ignored her militancy. They praised her charity, but ignored her rage. This sanitization was a political necessity. In the 1920s and 30s, America was segregated by law and custom. The KKK marched openly in Washington, D.C. The narrative of the lost cause, the lie that the Confederacy was a noble endeavor and slavery a benevolent institution, was the dominant history taught in schools. In this climate, a black woman who had actively killed the economic engine of the South and humiliated white men could not be celebrated as a hero. She was too dangerous. She was a threat to the racial hierarchy. So they hid the warrior inside the grandmother. They turned a wolf into a sheep. But while white America was busy rewriting her into a safe bedtime story, Black America was keeping the true fire burning. In the segregated schools of the South, in the churches of Harlem and Chicago, the oral history of the real Harriet Tubman was passed down like a secret code. Black teachers, teaching from ragged, hand-me-down textbooks that ignored their history, would close the books and tell the truth. They told their students about the gun. They told them about the Combahee River. They told them about the move or die philosophy. They used Harriet not as a symbol of passive endurance, but as a blueprint for active resistance. She became the patron saint of the new Negro movement of the 1920s. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance looked to her as an ancestor of black excellence. She wasn't a victim of slavery. She was its conqueror. This underground memory was vital. It ensured that when the next great wave of the freedom struggle arrived, the generation fighting it would know they stood on the shoulders of a giant. And that wave arrived in the 1950s. When we look at the civil rights movement, we often focus on Martin Luther King Jr. and the philosophy of nonviolence. But look closer. Look at the women who were the backbone of the movement. Look at Rosa Parks. We are taught that Rosa Parks was just a tired seamstress who didn't want to move her feet. That is a lie, just like the Aunt Harriet myth is a lie. Rosa Parks was a trained activist. She was the secretary of the NAACP. She had investigated the gang rapes of black women by white men. She was a warrior. And when she sat on that bus in Montgomery, she wasn't just sitting, she was holding the line. Parks and the women of her generation, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Septima Clark, were the spiritual daughters of Harriet Tubman. They possessed the same iron will. They faced the same terror, the bomb threats, the police dogs, the jail cells, with the same unshakable faith. There is a direct line of DNA from the Underground Railroad to the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Riders of 1961 boarded buses to travel into the Deep South, knowing they would be beaten and burned. It was a suicide mission into enemy territory to liberate the oppressed. Does that sound familiar? It was the Combahee River Raid on wheels. During this era, Harriet's image began to shift again. The Black Power movement of the late 60s and 70s reclaimed her fully. They dusted off the general. They put the gun back in her hand. They celebrated her not for her ability to endure suffering, but for her ability to inflict costs on the oppressor. Historians, particularly black female historians, began to dig into the archives with a new purpose. They weren't satisfied with the Moses myth. They wanted the military records. They wanted the pension files. They wanted the truth. This scholarly resurrection was explosive. It revealed the depths of her involvement in the war that had been glossed over for a century. It brought the Combahee River Raid back into the light. It proved, with documentation, that she was the first woman to lead an assault. Suddenly, the harmless old lady was revealed to be one of the most effective special operations commanders of the 19th century. This truth was uncomfortable for many. It challenged the patriarchal view of war, which said that combat was the exclusive domain of men. It challenged the white-centric view of the Civil War, which focused on Lincoln and Grant while ignoring the agency of the enslaved. But the truth, once out, could not be put back in the box. As the 20th century ended, the recognition that Harriet had been denied in life began to flow in death. Schools were named after her. Statues were erected, not just in Auburn, but in Boston, in Maryland, in the very landscapes where she had been hunted. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush proclaimed Harriet Tubman Day. In 2013, President Obama established the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Monument in Maryland. But the ultimate battlefield for her legacy opened in 2016. It wasn't in a history book or a museum. It was in your wallet. The United States Treasury announced a plan to redesign the $20 bill. The proposal was to remove the face of Andrew Jackson and replace it with the face of Harriet Tubman. This decision sparked a cultural firestorm that revealed just how powerful and how terrifying Harriet Tubman still is. Andrew Jackson was a slave owner. He was the architect of the Trail of Tears, the genocide that forcibly removed Native Americans from their lands. He represented the old, brutal, expansionist power of white America. Harriet Tubman was his polar opposite. She was the stolen property that returned to steal back. She was the freedom fighter. To put her face on the currency, the most potent symbol of American capitalism and power, was a radical act. It was a statement that the values of Harriet Tubman were the values of the nation. It was a symbolic conquering. The woman who had been bought and sold was now the face of the money itself. The backlash was fierce. Critics argued that it was political correctness. They argued that Jackson was a war hero, ignoring that Tubman was too. But the subtext of the anger was clear. They didn't want to look at a black woman every time they bought a loaf of bread. They didn't want to be reminded of the sin of slavery every time they opened their wallet. The redesign was delayed. Politics interfered. The administration changed. The bill was shelved, but the delay only made the symbol more powerful. Artists began to stamp Harriet's face over Jackson's on existing bills. The Tubman 20 became a symbol of resistance. It proved that you can keep her off the paper, but you can't get her out of the culture. The controversy proved that the war Harriet fought is not over. We are still fighting over who gets to be an American hero. We are still fighting over whose history matters. But here's the irony. Harriet wouldn't have cared about being on the money. She didn't care about wealth. She died poor because she gave everything she had to others. She wouldn't have wanted to be a symbol of capitalism. She would have wanted to know if we were free. She would have wanted to know if the prisons were empty. She would have wanted to know if the hungry were fed. She would have wanted to know if the voting booths were open. As we move into the final chapters of this story, we have to look at the world Harriet left us and the world we are living in now. We have to ask, what would the general do today? She wouldn't be waiting for a government bureaucrat to approve a design for a dollar bill. She wouldn't be arguing on Twitter. She would be in the trenches. She would be organizing. She would be moving. Because the most dangerous thing about Harriet Tubman wasn't her gun. It wasn't her spy network. It was her refusal to wait. She didn't wait for the Emancipation Proclamation. She freed herself. She didn't wait for the army to give her a commission. She took command. She didn't wait for permission to be a hero. That is the energy we need now. The energy of the general. In the next block, we will bring the story to its emotional conclusion. We will look at the specific lessons of her life for the modern warrior. We will connect her struggle to the struggles of today. And we will issue the final challenge. The general has cleared the path. Are you brave enough to walk it? The history books are rewritten. The statues are built. But the legacy is not in stone. It is in action, and the general is watching. To leave Harriet Tubman in the history books is to imprison her all over again. She is not a statue to be dusted off once a year during Black History Month. She is a blueprint. She is a manual for survival and conquest in a world that is stacked against you. When we strip away the myth and look at the mechanics of her life, we find a strategy for overcoming insurmountable odds that is as relevant today as it was in 1850. Her life offers a masterclass in the concept of authorization. We live in a world that teaches us to wait for permission. We are taught to wait for the degree, the job title, the election, the funding, the approval of the gatekeepers. We are told that we cannot lead until someone in power designates us a leader. Harriet Tubman shatters this lie. She had no authority. The law said she was property. The church, in the South, said she was a servant. The government said she was a fugitive. The military said she was a cook. By every metric of her society, she had zero authorization to change the world. She didn't wait for permission. She authorized herself. She looked at the laws of the United States and decided they were illegal in the eyes of God. She looked at the border of the plantation and decided it was a line she had the right to cross. She looked at the Union Army, a massive, white, male-dominated hierarchy, and decided she was a general. This is the most dangerous and powerful lesson she offers. Power is not given. It is assumed. If Harriet Tubman had waited for a white general to ask her to lead a raid, the Combahee River would never have burned. She stepped into the vacuum of leadership and filled it with her own will. For anyone today feeling marginalized, feeling unqualified, or feeling blocked by the system, Harriet is the ultimate proof that you do not need a title to take command. You just need the audacity to act. Her life also forces us to confront the architecture of fear. We often think of courage as the absence of fear. Harriet teaches us that courage is the management of fear. She was afraid. We know this from her interviews. She spoke of the terror of the woods, the heart-pounding moments when the slave catchers were near. She wasn't a robot. She was a human being who understood that fear is a biological signal, not a stop sign. She managed the fear of others with a ruthless compassion. When she pulled that revolver on the terrified fugitive, she wasn't just threatening him. She was shocking him out of his panic spiral. She understood that panic is contagious and lethal. In high-stakes situations, whether on a battlefield or in a boardroom or a community protest, the leader is the person who can absorb the collective fear of the group and transmute it into action. Harriet was a heat sink for terror. She took it in, neutralized it with her faith, and outputted direction. Furthermore, she teaches us the power of strategic invisibility. In our modern era, we are obsessed with visibility. We want to be seen, heard, followed, and liked. We equate influence with fame. Harriet Tubman operated in the shadows. She understood that if you want to dismantle a system, you don't announce your plans on the front page. You work quietly. You build networks. You move in the dark. She destroyed the slave economy of the Eastern Shore, not by making speeches, but by stealing its capital, its labor force, one night at a time. She showed that the most effective activism is often the work that no one sees until it is too late to stop it. She reminds us that results matter more than recognition. While the politicians in Washington were debating the philosophy of slavery, Harriet was in the mud, actually freeing people. It is a challenge to the modern performative culture. Are you doing the work, or are you just posting about it? Her life is also a testament to the intersectionality of struggle. Harriet Tubman did not have the luxury of fighting just one war. She fought racism. She fought sexism. She fought ableism, dealing with her disability in a world that had no mercy for the weak. She fought classism, poverty. She fought ageism, continuing her work into her 90s. She proves that these struggles cannot be siloed. You cannot fight for black rights without fighting for women's rights. You cannot fight for freedom without fighting for economic justice. When she opened her home for the aged, she was acknowledging that liberation is hollow if you are free, but starving. She understood the holistic nature of freedom. It wasn't just about breaking chains. It was about building a life. And let us look at her faith as a tactical asset. In a secular age, it is easy to dismiss her visions as a quirk of her neurology, but look at the tactical results. Her faith gave her the OODA loop speed, observe, orient, decide, act, of a modern fighter pilot. Because she believed she was guided by God, she made decisions instantly. She didn't suffer from analysis paralysis. In a chaotic environment, the person who makes the fastest decision usually wins. Harriet's faith was her decision-making engine. It allowed her to navigate complexity with simple, brutal clarity. Whether you call it God, intuition, or subconscious processing, she teaches us that we must learn to trust our inner voice over the noise of the world. The experts said it was impossible to raid the Combahee. The experts said the river was too mined. Her inner voice said go. She went. She won. Finally, she represents the long game. Harriet Tubman fought for 90 years. She fought as a young woman running through the woods. She fought as a middle-aged woman leading soldiers. She fought as an old woman arguing for a pension. She fought as a dying woman, setting up a charity. She never retired. She never said, "I've done enough." She understood that the struggle for justice is not a battle. It is a war that spans generations. She accepted that she might not see the final victory, but she refused to stop marching toward it. This is a hard lesson for a generation used to instant gratification. We want the world to change with one election, one protest, one viral video. Harriet tells us that change is a grind. It is slow, painful, and often unrewarding. It requires the stamina to keep walking when your feet are bleeding and the North Star is hidden behind the clouds. But look at what that stamina achieved. She started as a piece of property worth a few $100s. She ended as a woman who had helped destroy the Confederate States of America. She started as an illiterate girl. She ended as a national icon whose face will eventually be on the currency of the nation that enslaved her. She proves that the trajectory of a life is not determined by its origin. It is determined by its velocity and its vector. She set her vector north, toward freedom, and she never deviated. As we stand in the 21st century, facing our own monsters, systemic racism, voter suppression, economic inequality, the rollback of rights, we often feel overwhelmed. The systems seem too big. The opposition seems too strong. Harriet Tubman laughs at our despair. She faced the United States government when it allowed human beings to be bought and sold. She faced the Confederate Army. She faced bloodhounds and bounty hunters. She faced them with nothing but a pistol and a prayer. And she beat them. She is the proof that the system is not invincible. It is made of men, and men can be outwitted. Men can be outfought. Men can be defeated. She is the mirror in which we must examine ourselves. When we claim we are too tired, too poor, too uneducated, or too powerless to make a difference, Harriet Tubman stands before us, scars on her head and mud on her boots, and asks, "What is your excuse?" She removed every excuse. She left us with nowhere to hide. The general has given us the battle plan. She has drawn the map. She has shown us that the only way out of the darkness is to walk through it. In the final block, we will say goodbye to the general. We will issue the final call to action. We will ask the world to finally, fully, and without reservation, salute the greatest soldier America never officially commissioned. The story is ending, but the march continues. The general is waiting for us to catch up.